Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Middle East on edge, a day after Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah exchanged their most serious strike since the beginning of the war in Gaza. Traders counting down to a Fed rate cut after Jay Powell's Jackson Hole speech pointed towards the start of monetary policy easing. And today's big take, we look at how the spread of the potentially deadly virus Mpox could have been avoided. Well, good morning again, everybody. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jomana Bersachi here in Dubai, back after a couple of weeks off. Good to be back, I got to say. And interesting, I was just taking a look at how some of these markets were faring over the course of the last couple of weeks. Remember, 3 weeks ago at exactly this time, we were talking about the massive VAR shake-off, that big sell-off that started in Japan, the pullback in the Nikkei, the big sell-off that we saw in the yen, and the subsequent impact it had in global markets. Well, guess what? Poof, all of that is being gone now, erased from markets' memories. And we're once again inching towards global stock market highs, no doubt aided by some of the commentary that came through on Friday from Jackson Hole, from Powell, signaling very strongly that they are ready to start the easing cycle. So on the back of that, we saw yet more green on the board, with some of those Wall Street majors ending the day up more than 1%. Today, the futures are leaning towards negative, moderately so, down about 0.1%, but still a very strong reaction. This was actually the close for the Nasdaq, up 1.2%. The market's futures are leaning slightly more mixed this morning. Two-year yields also in focus. Yesterday, Friday, we saw them rally about 8 basis points after Powell signaled that they were considering cutting or starting the interest rate cutting cycle as soon as September. There are now about 100 basis points priced in, which means that there are more than 25 basis points of cuts priced in for the subsequent 3 meetings that are coming up, some even saying that they could go for as much as 50. So a big 8 basis points rally that we saw on Friday. This morning, another 2 basis points lower. The DXY, the USD, also pulling back about 1% in Friday's trade as well. Switching over, I just want to draw your attention to oil this morning, namely because of all of the, once again, geopolitical developments over the weekend. We finally got the retaliation from Hezbollah into Israel after the assassination of its senior commander about a couple of weeks ago. And so this was the initial impact that we got on the oil complex. Typically, though, what you see is the geopolitical premium that gets built into oil doesn't tend to last very long. And so this morning, oil is up about 0.5% on back of the flaring up of tensions. But we're going to talk more about that and the fact that even though we have seen an escalation, there's also been somewhat of a de-escalation in the last 24 hours as well. So just park that thought. We'll talk more about it in a couple of moments. But for now, as ever, let's check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio standing by. Avril, good to see you again.
Great to see you, Jomana. We're seeing Asia stocks today in a bit of a mixed bag performance. And it was starting the day on the front foot, but if you take a look at Asia stock gauge, it's pulled away from those session highs. And I think investors are turning a bit more cautious. It's not just about the Middle East tensions. This week, we also have the earnings from NVIDIA. Of course, that is going to potentially be a key factor that's driving some of these tech stocks in Japan, in South Korea as well. TAIEX still doing fairly well today, but the added headwind for the Japanese stock benchmark, of course, is the strength we're seeing in the Japanese currency. That is playing out on the export-related names on a day where markets overall have been pretty buoyant, thanks to the confidence that we're going to see those Fed rate cuts. That's the state of play in this part of the world. Jomana.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the theme du jour. Everyone's talking about when this first rate cut is going to happen and how big it's going to be. Avril, thank you so much for the overview. Let's talk about some of the events over the weekend now in the region. A relative calm is holding in the Middle East after Israel's Sunday bombing raids on southern Lebanon. Israel says it took out thousands of Hezbollah missile launchers based on intelligence that the Lebanon-based militant group planned imminent attacks.
We follow Hezbollah for weeks with technological means and air patrols by Air Force planes. At the moment, we detected an intention on the part of Hezbollah to carry out the attack, and we eliminated most of them.
Now, both Israel and Hezbollah have announced that for the moment, their operations are over despite ongoing low-level fighting.
If the result is not sufficient in our opinion, we will reserve the right to respond at another time. Let the people relax. Whoever wants to go back home can go back home. The country must calm down again.
The country must calm down again. All right, for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Paul Wallace. Paul, good to have you on set today. Let's just talk about what happened, because it's been a few weeks now. The whole world, not just the region, had been anticipating some sort of a response from Hezbollah to the killing of Fouad Shukr. It came, and yet here we are 24 hours later, and the analysis from what we've seen is that this is potentially a de-escalatory escalation.
It looks like that way, I think, mainly because there was only one person killed in Israel. That was a soldier that got killed by shrapnel from an interceptor missile. There was very little damage. In all, this was an extremely successful defensive operation by the Israeli military to thwart this attack. In southern Lebanon, there were reports of 3 people dying. I think all of them were non-civilians. So all in all, it was dramatic yesterday. But the damage and the number of casualties were not high. So I think that's why we've got relative calm today. If Hezbollah had managed to cause a lot of damage in Israel, and or if it had killed many people, especially civilians, then I think we would be facing a very different situation today. And Israel might well have been preparing for, or even have started an all-out war with Hezbollah. Tensions are still extremely high, though, and I think no one's under any illusions that we're sort of out of the woods just yet. Yeah, though I think it is interesting to draw on Hassan Nasrallah's speech yesterday afternoon, because he seemed to suggest that this phase was over and that they would see and assess in the coming weeks whether or not there needs to be another phase of attacks as well, which, you know, he was also sending a message to the Lebanese public and that people can finally relax. So at least for this part of the tit for tat, you can assume that things are going to calm down. But then, of course, there's the other element, which is Ismail Haniyeh was also killed in Tehran the same evening as the Hezbollah commander was killed. Is there going to be a retaliation from the Iranian side now that we need to be on alert for? Exactly. Killed just hours after Fouad Shukr was in Beirut, and we're still waiting for that Iranian response. They say it's coming. They say they're biding their time, though, and they're not under any rush. And I think it, to some extent, plays into Iran's hands to keep Israel on very high alert and to sort of stretch Israel's intelligence and military forces. One thing we don't really know yet is what part Iran played in yesterday's attacks by Hezbollah. It is the main sponsor of Hezbollah, but there's been no sort of indication yet that it was directly involved and or sort of gave Hezbollah orders to go about with that. Iran is not saying anything yet in terms of, okay, that, you know, what happened yesterday was part of our own response. So I think Israel will still be bracing or preparing, if you like, for the possibility of Tehran launching some kind of attack on Israel. Yeah, we have to park that thought also with the ongoing ceasefire discussions. I'm going to pick up the discussion with Niamh. Paul, thank you very much for joining us. More analysis with Niamh McBurney, Associate Director at Control Risk, joining us now here in Dubai. Well, you've been on our set a couple of times the last few months, Niamh, and I've got to say, you've been pretty negative and pessimistic about the situation up in the north. You'd always warned that things were going to get worse between Lebanon and Israel. And of course, these events did unfold over the course of the weekend. But as Paul was just describing, it could have been a lot worse. So what is your take on what we saw?
Paul's absolutely right. It could have been a lot worse, but the way the last 24 hours played out really shows us that both sides are trying to manage this very, very closely. Iran hasn't responded yet. It will respond at some point. But that will, of course, have, very little bearing ultimately on the dynamics in the north. And Netanyahu said yesterday in statements after the attack, after the kind of back and forth, that he would look to return Israeli citizens to the northern district in safety. So we are out of the woods for the moment when it comes to an immediate escalation on the northern border, on Israel's southern border. But re-establishing deterrence and security is still a key priority for Netanyahu's government.
How realistic is it on both sides for Lebanese residents to return to the southern border, for Israeli residents to return to the northern border? Because as long as there's still ongoing daily crossfire, and we're not talking about the big retaliations of the sort of the weekend, but there's been daily exchange of fire since October 7, doesn't really create for relaxing living conditions. So, what appetite is there actually going to be for the public to move back to those original locations, knowing that there could be the potential for flare-up at any time?
Well, very limited. There's just been an increase in the Israeli budget approved for 3.4 million shekels, I believe, of additional spending, the majority of which is going to go to support for citizens of or residents of the northern district. So the government feels that, you know, they need that additional support. This could go on for some time.
People say within Lebanon that Hezbollah today is very different from the Hezbollah of 2006. 2006, they had something to prove. And of course, there was a more than 30-day war that happened then, very costly for both Israel and for Lebanon at the time. And you fast forward to today, and people say that Hezbollah are in a much stronger position because they've accumulated a massive military arsenal. They've got a lot more fighters. And they're also a very strong political power in Lebanon in 2024. That wasn't the case in 2006. They had something to prove. Because of that, do you think that that allows Hassan Nasrallah to sound almost less combative?
Potentially, but it's about managing their own exposure at home. They have a lot more to lose now than they did in 2006. And what's been interesting about the last 24 hours is the way Hezbollah carried out its strikes and its rocket attacks. The way Nasrallah himself said everyone can calm down now. It shows that Tehran isn't dictating all of the terms. It's aware of Hezbollah's domestic constraints, and Hezbollah was allowed to react within that context. But ultimately, there's an awful lot that Hezbollah has to kind of keep in mind as it goes ahead with this. It has more to lose: political power, social influence, which is one of the things that's slightly holding it back, ultimately.
I thought it was interesting as well in Hassan Nasrallah's speech. He mentioned that the reason it took so long for them to retaliate is because they were waiting to see what would happen with these ceasefire discussions. And of course, there hasn't been a lot of progress with ceasefire discussions, even though they're still taking place. Negotiations are still ongoing. Even on Sunday, I thought it was interesting. An Israeli delegation still went to Cairo to continue with the talks. How optimistic are you that we are going to get to a ceasefire deal at some point in the next few weeks? The U.S. are really pushing hard for it now.
So the U.S. are pushing really hard, but the new kind of condition that Netanyahu put on the table that his negotiating team are trying to follow through with is having IDF forces stationed not permanently, temporarily, in the Philadelphia corridor along the border. However, that's in direct breach of the Egyptian-Israeli 1979 peace treaty. So at this point, although Hamas have a problem with this, you have to get the Egyptians to accept this as well. So as much as the U.S. pushes, there's still a long way to go here.
Yeah, though also I was reading that there potentially could be a compromise and that they could pull back, say, 100 meters or 200 meters away from the border. So there is some room for maneuver there. How do you think a passage of a ceasefire would affect the regional dynamics? Because, again, we're talking about the potential retaliation from Iran. If there is a ceasefire deal passed, would we just assume that Iran will no longer have to respond to the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran?
I think we're still probably enough weeks away from a ceasefire being called that there is actually still time for Iran to respond, ultimately. Even then, I think it would look to not to undermine a ceasefire, but it also needs to be able to reestablish deterrence for itself as a nation. And it kind of regardless of the other circumstances around this. So there is potential that it could react, but obviously it would, I think, if a ceasefire was agreed and not permanent, but seemed fairly robust, and a lot more robust than it seems right now, they would probably look to react in a slightly measured way, maybe something in the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf or something.
Right, but not as similar to what we got back in April.
Exactly.
Yeah. Niamh, always a pleasure to chat to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Niamh McBurney, Associate Director at Control Risks. There's certainly a lot to discuss this morning in the Middle East. Well, coming up, another major story, this one for global markets. Fed Chair Jay Powell making it crystal clear that interest rate cuts are coming next month. We get UBP's market strategy next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Asian stocks advanced and the yen strengthened to a 3-week high as investors took positions in anticipation of a Fed cut in September. Speaking at Jackson Hole, Fed Chair Jay Powell gave his clearest signal yet that long-awaited rate cuts are imminent.
The time has come for policy to adjust. The direction of travel is clear, and the timing and pace of rate cuts will depend on incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks.
Let's bring in Eleanor Jolidon, Swiss and Global Equity Co-Head at Union Bancaire Privee. Thank you so much for joining us, Eleanor. Interesting to hear that one specific line from Jay Powell. I'm just going to read it out again for emphasis. The timing and pace will depend on incoming data. Many people are picking up on the fact that he opened the door potentially to a 50 basis point cut by mentioning the word pace, which indicates that perhaps Fed Chair Jay Powell is a lot more dovish than many of us had thought him to be.
Possibly, but he certainly hasn't signed on the dotted line that that's what he's going to do. Certainly there has been hope that change of pattern was going to come through at the Fed. Remember, it's only a couple of months ago that people were actually expecting a cut back in March, which was perhaps somewhat optimistic. But nevertheless, let's not lose sight of the fact that if you have to cut rates faster, that actually also suggests that the economy is doing less well. So a 50 basis point cut would be a reflection of that weaker data we saw at the end of July, and which did somewhat spook the markets at that point. When we talk about pace, it could be, yes, something which affects in the immediate term and therefore in September, but you can also see that being perhaps a more regular cut at a smaller level as well. So maybe a 25 basis points cut to start off with, and then maybe a more frequent 25 basis cuts as with the year progresses and as we go into 2025. So you're always going to have a debate in the market as to what level and what pace those cuts have. I think the main point is that there is now a suggestion that they are going to start. That's actually very much in line with the scenario we had in our Swiss and Global team, that we were going to see rate cuts during 2024, but more skewed to the end of the year than some of the, what I would call, misplaced optimism that was seen at the beginning of this year.
Yeah. What I thought is interesting about the way global markets have been behaving, I was off for a couple of weeks and I came back and I thought, it was fascinating that the S&P is very close to all-time highs again. The Nikkei has completely shrugged off that sell-off that we had just 3 weeks ago. And yet fundamentals haven't changed. A couple of weeks ago, we were still talking about the same things that we're talking about now, be it the global economic slowdown, the fact that the U.S. are getting worried about the labor market, might have to cut 50 basis points. Again, still concentrated pockets of positioning in some of these markets. Why do investors pick and choose when fundamentals matter?
The investors are working on something which is called a market. That means that you have different opinions. You also have different levels. I mean, maybe the world just couldn't think straight because you were on holiday, who knows? But certainly there were lower levels of staffing, probably lower liquidity was obvious in the market a few weeks ago. And that probably did lead to a somewhat short-term emotional reaction for some players in the market. That happens at all times. I remain fairly confident that the market over the medium to the long term is relatively sanguine and realistic, but there can be short-term moves. And indeed, it was surprising to see those very sharp moves in Japan, but they did indeed correct very rapidly because I think there was probably an understanding that they had been an over-exaggeration.
Yeah. How close are you watching the NVIDIA earnings this week for signals of where stocks go from here?
Well, when you see the size of NVIDIA as a company and its effect on market movements, obviously it is an important stock to look at. But let's also remember that NVIDIA is perhaps not a best indicator of economic activity globally. What is pushing NVIDIA at the moment is a desire for very large, very wealthy companies to prepare for their expectations of how artificial intelligence can be a revenue-driven driving activity for them in the future. So I wouldn't say that if you're looking at the economy, that it is NVIDIA which is going to lead you to some kind of insights that you would not otherwise have from looking at economic data and perhaps other activities on the market and quoted companies on the market, which may reflect better how the consumer is feeling, how businesses are feeling, and where businesses are investing.
Yeah. Contrary to broader public opinion, it isn't all just about one stock, and that stock being NVIDIA. There's a lot more to look at. Eleanor, thank you so much for coming on our show today. Eleanor Taylor Jolidon, Swiss and Global Equity Co-Head at Union Bancaire Privee. Now, plenty more coming up here on Horizons Middle East and Africa. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Bersachi in Dubai. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Kyiv's incursion into Russia is part of an effort to make Moscow accept a fair peace. Ukrainian forces claim to control over 1,200 square kilometers of territory in its first foreign military offensive inside Russia since World War II. Russia's defense ministry says its troops continue to repel Kyiv's efforts in several areas in the Kursk region. And China will reportedly bring up issues related to Taiwan during the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's visit to Beijing this week. Sullivan is set to meet with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi as well as Chinese leader Xi Jinping as the two geopolitical rivals look to maintain dialogue. Beijing is also planning to bring up export controls as well as U.S. measures to cut off China from vital technology, including semiconductors. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign and its affiliates say they raised $82 million during the Democratic Convention in Chicago last week. That pushes their total fundraising haul to $540 million since President Joe Biden announced he would step aside. The money raised underscores the tailwind behind Harris that has reshaped the race against Donald Trump. The campaign says a third of those who contributed during the convention were first-time donors and two-thirds were women. And a quick look at some of these equity market futures as we head into the U.S. and European sessions. Equity futures trading sideways, but of course building on from some of the solid gains that we had on Friday. Wall Street up more than 1%. Some indicators, MSCI gauge of global shares hitting an all-time high. Euro Stoxx futures also closed higher on Friday, but today pointing to a slightly weaker opening. Also coming up on our show, we're going to be talking about Dubai's property market, which is red hot as the super rich continue flocking to the glittering city. More in a moment with BinGhatti's chairman. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Middle East on edge, a day after Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah exchanged their most serious strikes since the beginning of the war in Gaza. Traders counting down to a Fed rate cut after Jay Powell's Jackson Hole speech pointed towards the start of monetary policy easing. And today's big take, we look at how the spread of the potentially deadly virus Mpox could have been avoided. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johanna Bersachi in Dubai, getting you up to speed on all of the developments over here in the region and the tit-for-tat, the strikes, counter-strikes between Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah over the course of the weekend. We spoke about that at the top part of the show. But then also the other major event was Jackson Hole on Friday, where we got some remarkably dovish commentary from the Fed Chair Jay Powell, indicating that the first cut could come as soon as September. In fact, markets are pricing more than 30 basis points worth of cuts for that September meeting. So what we saw was a positive reaction out of stock markets on Friday. Wall Street closed up more than 1% for both the S&P and NASDAQ. Today, futures are tilted towards the red, dipping about 0.1% as we get into the European session. Two-year yield, as you can see, below 4%, 3.89 is where we're sitting now. We've rallied about 2.5 basis points in today's session overnight. On Friday, we saw an even bigger rally of about 8 basis points again as traders started to account for the beginning of this easing cycle out of the Fed. And then the dollar slipping somewhat on Friday, down about 1% over the course of the week. Last week, down about 1.2% as well. This, again, as the market starts to price in the beginning of the Fed's easing cycle versus other central banks which have already begun the easing cycle. So it's a relative gain here of the USD versus other currency pairs. Well, I also spoke about some of the geopolitical tensions in the region as well. How is that impacting oil prices? Interesting to see that this time around you did see somewhat of an impact on the price of oil, about 0.5% or so this morning. But typically what we notice is over the last couple of months, every time there's been a flaring up of geopolitical sensitivities in the region, the impact on oil has been rather short-lived. So yes, we've seen a little bit of an uptick today, but oil analysts will tell you that there are other bigger drivers in the market, namely concerns about demand, about the softening China outlook, in addition to a lot of non-OPEC supply that continues to hit the market and puts a cap on some of where these oil prices can trade. So just bear that in mind as we talk about the geopolitical escalation. But as ever, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril is in our Singapore studio. Avril.
Yeah, Jumana, we're seeing Asia's stock gauge slipping off those session highs as the session progresses. I think a more cautious picture is emerging among investors, given what we're seeing in the Middle East, but also particularly in Japan. You're seeing the Nikkei, the topics today that started on the back foot already, still hanging on to those losses of about 1%. No thanks to what we're seeing in the Japanese currency, as a stronger yen weighs typically on the exporters' earnings. And there is a sense that we could see a Japanese currency sustainably stronger from here on out. And it makes you wonder what some of these Japanese companies that drafted their business plans before what we see in dollar yen are going to be thinking, how is that going to affect the picture for them going forward? And of course, the yen strength also helped along by what we got from Ueda and Powell, but also a bit of safe haven demand today, given what we're seeing in the Middle East, Jumana.
Excellent. Avril, thank you so much for the overview. Well, let's turn to another topic now. Here in Dubai, property prices have been on a tear since 2020, up on average by 60%. One of the highlights has been sustained strength at the high end of the market as the world's wealthy flock to the city. BinGhatti Properties is amongst those hoping to cash in after announcing Mercedes-branded tower, where some apartments will cost up to $10 million. Really happy to say that joining us now is Mohammed BinGhatti, the chairman of BinGhatti Holding. Wonderful to have you with us on the show.
Likewise.
I noticed last year that the Bugatti residences by BinGhatti achieved record-breaking highest rate per square foot milestone. This was a really impressive number, and I do think it is pretty impressive in the context of broader real estate dynamics, just how well the prime real estate market is doing. What is the outlook for the rest of this year?
Well, I think we're in a position where there will be steady growth. If you look at the IMF position on the economy of the UAE, the IMF forecasts a growth of the economy of 4%, and the central bank is slightly more optimistic at 4.2%, with expectations in the rise of oil production. If you look at the data released by DLD recently, the market's been doing exceptionally well in Dubai. So we've seen some 50,000 new customers come into the market, 100,000 transactions with a record high figure of around $100 billion. That represents a 23% increase year on year. Yields stand steadfast between 7 to 10%. And if you look at the report issued by Jalal Mina for Q1 2024, we saw an average of increasing capital gains and rental yields of around 21%. So I think we're on pace for steady growth this year.
But yeah, this is a significant chunk of cash, right? We're talking about $10 million. What is enticing customers to come in and pay such a premium for property?
I think it's the value proposition. If you look at Dubai and you benchmark against a lot of cities around the world now, prices per square foot, London this year scored on average $868 per square foot. Singapore came in at $765. You have LA at $663, and Dubai, despite all price hikes, still sits at $352 per square foot only, so half the price of LA. That's one angle. The other angle is if you look at what you're getting versus what you're paying. $1 million in Dubai gets you at least 1,000 square feet on average in 3 of Dubai's most prime residential areas, as opposed to a city like Monte Carlo, where it secures you only 172 square feet on average. And I think the international buyer is noticing that day by day, and that's what's bringing those ultra-high net worth individuals.
Yeah. What geographies are these international buyers coming from?
Frankly speaking, from all over the world. I mean, every day we discover new nationalities in our statistics. A lot of people coming in from Europe, from Canada. We have a lot of Indians coming in most recently, and some investors from the GCC. So it's quite a diverse mix.
Yeah, there was a lot written about Russian investors coming in after the beginning of the war. Did you see that as well in your own transactions?
Definitely, we did see that pattern. It did soften quite recently, and we saw a bigger diversity in different nationalities. But yeah, it was there for sure last year.
My colleague Zainab Fatah on the Bloomberg print side wrote a very interesting piece about a month ago talking about how Dubai has become a lot more resilient to the boom and bust cycle in the real estate market, namely because of, again, as you mentioned, just healthy influx of demand, good favorable conditions for buyers, access to funding. Are you of the same view as well, that Dubai has managed somehow to escape its typical boom and bust cycle that it had experienced over the course of the last decade or so?
Absolutely, I am of that view, and I think that lends itself to the populational growth we've seen. So there's an organic demand chasing the supply. On average, every quarter we've seen the population grow by 25,000 new inhabitants, out of which are many ultra high net worth individuals buying properties in Dubai. I also think that the government has been very prudent in terms of its legislative policies recently. So we saw the 10-year golden visa program aimed at buyers buying properties for $1 million dirhams or more, or even just skilled individuals. A lot of my executives in the company are actually homeowners now. They've purchased properties. And then you have projects like the Al Maktoum airport, which will increase government expenditure and create thousands of jobs. And obviously these people have to become homeowners one way or another.
Yeah, we were speaking to the Dubai airport CEO just a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the potential of that new airport. One thing that's interesting about BinGhatti is that you also do a lot of partnerships. So we started off this segment talking about the new Mercedes partnership that you have, some apartment blocks that you're going to be building, but you've also done something similar with Jacob. You've done it with BinGhatti as well. We also spoke about that. So why do those tie-ups make sense for a real estate company?
That's a very good question. So I think in light of the luxury market right now and the people who are coming in from all around the world, having a global brand on board really resonates with a lot of people who perhaps are new to the market but not new to the brands that we've partnered with. I think also what's important for us is it's the first time this is being done globally, so the first BinGhatti residences and the only one worldwide. So it gives that exclusivity to the product. And I think really for us it's more than just putting a logo on a building. We really want to create authentic luxury, really create the touch points that you see or experience perhaps in the automotive industry, but is missing from the real estate narrative.
And just very quickly, are you looking to expand into any other regional markets, or are you focused here for the time being?
We are focused on Dubai mainly. We're very focused on the Dubai market, but we are eyeing some markets like Saudi Arabia and the UK.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll have to have you come back on when you start venturing into those markets as well. Sir, a real pleasure to chat to you. Mohammed BinGhatti, chairman of BinGhatti Holding. Well, for more of these stories looking into the intersection of wealth and power in the region, sign up for our Mideast Money newsletter on Bloomberg.com. And you can see that is where you can subscribe on your screens right now. Now, for a look at some of the other stories we're following. Shares in Saudi Arabia's top telecom company rose the most in 16 years after announcing plans to boost quarterly dividends. The firm also says it's considering handing over more money to investors via special payments. The company is majority owned by the Sovereign Wealth Fund and is pursuing expansion plans as it looks to grow beyond Saudi's borders. Also coming up, missed opportunities and a lack of funding. Scientists and public health officials say the Mpox global health emergency could have been avoided. We'll have the details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Well, oil has edged higher after Israel launched what it calls a preemptive strike on Hezbollah in Lebanon and declared a 48-hour state of emergency. The Iran-backed militant group responded by firing more than 200 projectiles, which caused minimal damage. Brent is heading towards $80, while WTI climbed past $75 a barrel. So let's bring in our senior energy reporter, Stephen Sutinsky. Stephen, I was talking about this earlier on the show, because typically whenever we see this flaring up of geopolitical tensions in the region, you see somewhat of a short-lived impact on the price of oil. To your mind, why did we see an uptick in the price of oil this morning?
Well, I mean, first, to go to your first point, it's diminishing returns. I think that there's this fear that any conflict that brings in Iran, which is an oil producer and exporter, into the Middle East could kind of evolve into a wider conflict. That risks potentially get other suppliers involved and therefore maybe reduce exports from the region or risk lower output. That's the really worst case scenario. But so far, since this Israel-Hamas conflict has begun at the end of last year, we haven't really seen any big impact really on production at all. It's mostly just been sentiment. And that war sentiment and risk premium has been in the market. And you do see, a jump in prices when there's something, but then usually it will end the day down back towards where it was earlier.
Yeah. But again, what we've been talking about when we speak about the outlook for oil has mainly been about global demand, some of the weaker recovery signals coming through from China. How would you describe the demand picture for oil right now?
I think that the demand picture for oil, especially when you look at China, has been somewhat disappointing for traders and those watching the market. I think there was an expectation that Chinese imports would be higher, but we've seen them slump amid China's weaker economic growth, as well as transition to cheaper and sometimes cleaner fuels. India as well has been underperforming what some thought in the market where they should be. So I think the next goalpost will be, what does OPEC Plus do with this data? What do they do with a market that's looking frothier than it was a few months back, when they were deciding to add barrels to the market and increase production in the fourth quarter, because they're going to be coming to that decision later whether they're going to follow through with their plan to add about 500,000 barrels a day in the next few months, and whether or not they should kind of take a pause and say, hey, maybe we should keep these restraints in place as to create a greater balance. Because if you add those back, analysts are expecting that you're going to see an increase, sort of an oversupply in the market, an increase in inventories in some places.
Yeah, it also feels like the soft-spoken number for OPEC is around $80, and with Brent sitting just shy of that, feels very unlikely that they'd willingly choose to bring more barrels to the market that could supply some more downward pressure. So it will be interesting to see what OPEC Plus decide to do from here. Stephen, thank you so much for the overview. Well, Mpox is a global health emergency that scientists say could have been avoided. Lost opportunities and a lack of funding have contributed to the spread of the virus in Central Africa. The World Health Organization has declared it a global health emergency, with 575 people now confirmed dead in the Democratic Republic of Congo this year, amongst many thousands of infections. So for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's healthcare reporter, Janice Q, who joins me now from Johannesburg. Janice, why are public health officials saying this is a global health emergency that could have been avoided?
Morning. The issue really has been one of inaction in the region. So Mpox has been circulating in Africa for decades, but the region really hasn't had a lot of attention until now. When the last public health emergency for Mpox was declared ended in May 2023, the virus continued to circulate, and it's now mutated. And I think the feeling and the frustration of a lot of people on the ground is that if they had more attention, better resources, things could have looked very different.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying that the virus mutated. Is there anything that could have been done then to contain the virus early on?
Definitely. If things have been identified, when it was identified that there had been a mutation, if there had been vaccines, if there had been better surveillance, better testing, there definitely could have been a stemming of the spread, and we probably would have seen it contained. Historically, Mpox has not been something that has had long human-to-human transmission chains, and this is one of the key things that have alarmed scientists and people on the ground in this particular outbreak.
So what is being done now, not just within Africa, but around the world, to deal with the likely spread of Mpox?
Both Africa CDC and the WHO, the World Health Organization, have declared emergencies, continental and global, respectively. And this has really started marshalling resources. We are hoping and expecting to see vaccines on the ground in the DRC within days, certainly by the end of the week, hopefully. And there is an effort to make sure that some of the basics are being taken care of as well. Things like making sure there's enough water so that there can be good hand hygiene, and getting the public messaging out so that people understand what they're looking at, getting rid of some of the stigma that's been around this disease in the region, to convince people that anyone can get this, and that it should be taken seriously, and that if you present yourself early with symptoms, it is very treatable. The case fatality rate is sitting somewhere between 3% and 6%, depending on the area you're looking at, and that can be reduced if measures are taken early. And this marshalling of resources, getting more funding, getting more attention is definitely the step in the right direction.
Yeah. Absolutely, and one that we're going to monitor very closely. Janice, thank you so much for the overview. That was Janice Hugh in Johannesburg. Well, also coming up, the CEO of Telegram may have his detention in France extended for another 24 hours. We'll bring you all the details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Messaging app Telegram is questioning the grounds for France's detention of its CEO and co-founder. Paul Durov was taken into custody at a Paris airport over the weekend on suspicion of failing to take steps to prevent criminal use of the platform, according to the AFP. His original detention was extended by 24 hours late Sunday. So for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's tech reporter, Annabelle Drulers. Annabelle, just walk us through exactly what happened and why Mr. Durov was arrested.
Yeah, I think you've just shared some of the key details there, Jumana, but essentially these details that came through over the weekend. So Pavel Durov, he is, as you say, the co-founder, the CEO of Telegram, the popular messaging app, and he was coming back from Azerbaijan. That's what the AFP reported over the weekend on Saturday, where he was detained at Le Bourget Airport, which is on the outskirts of Paris. The suspicion here is that he failed to take steps to prevent the criminal use of Telegram, and I think that really points to one of the key question marks around this messaging app. It's used by hundreds of millions of people around the world, but it has really become a focus of extremist activity online. For instance, earlier this month we had those anti-immigrant riots in the UK, and Telegram was really front and centre here, and perhaps used as a tool to foment and to coordinate some of these demonstrations. That light touch approach to content moderation as well, that's really a key focus area for a lot of governments now. And so again, what was reported by the AFP is that OVMIN, which is an agency used to prevent or combat violence against minors, young people, they're the ones that issued the arrest warrant for Durov.
Yeah, I mean, over here in the region, we're watching it very closely as well, because according to his Telegram bio, he also has citizenship of the UAE. He's got dual citizenship of both France and the UAE, obviously Russian-born, which creates a very interesting diplomatic setup. But I just wonder how the company itself, how Telegram has actually responded to these allegations.
Well, we got the response from Telegram just a few hours ago, and it was probably as you would expect. They're essentially saying that Telegram is abiding by all of the laws or regulations in the EU, that the CEO has nothing to hide and actually that he travels frequently around the continent. Also that they're awaiting a prompt resolution. You're seeing here the statement they put out on X earlier. But certainly, as you say, that diplomatic issue here that comes afoot, because, yes, Durov is someone who's Russian-born. We don't know if he's renounced his Russian citizenship, but certainly we've already heard from the Russian embassy in France urging officials there to take this case, give an explanation of the reasons, ensuring his rights, providing consular access. So they're also looking to assist here or to get involved. And yes, you've got that UAE and that French citizenship in play as well. But what's next is that we could actually see Durov fronting the courts on Monday. As you said there earlier, he's already had his detention extended by 24 hours. So again, it's very much wait and see, but perhaps we'll get a bigger update in just later Monday.
Yeah. Bloomberg's tech reporter, Annabelle Drewlers, thank you so much for the latest on Telegram. Now, a quick look at markets. And, of course, a big event on Friday with Jackson Hole, with the Fed Chair Jerome Powell signaling that a rate cut could be coming as soon as September. The equity market reaction on Friday was pretty positive, with all of Wall Street up more than 1%. Today, futures not doing much, leaning towards the red, down about 6-7 basis points. But big drivers coming up this week, including NVIDIA earnings on Wednesday and core PCE, that PCE number that the Fed care about on Friday. So that is it for markets, and that is it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. I will be back in a few moments. This is Bloomberg.